My name is Sam Jenks, and welcome to another episode of The Way We Source, a podcast hosted by Kodiak Hub, where we share our talks with procurement practitioners, leaders, experts, consultants, content gurus, and people that we find downright inspiring, diving into the role that sourcing and procurement plays in the way we live. If you like today's episode, as always, make sure to rate the program and give us a follow. Today, we have the honor of hosting the architect of procurement excellence, or one of the architects, a strategic powerhouse whose fingerprints are on some of the world's most transformative sourcing programs out there. As principal and global procurement advisory practice leader at the Hackett Group, this person has spent over 2 decades guiding the Fortune 500 through procurement reinvention, operational efficiency, and digital evolution. He's a trusted advisor, prolific speaker, and a cornerstone of modern procurement strategy. That's right. We're talking about none other than Mr. Chris Sawchuk. Chris, welcome to the show.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sam. I look forward to our discussion. I know we were just talking a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, and certainly it's something that we've been talking about for some time, and had an opportunity to gain some new insights into this area that we're going to be touching on in terms of those priorities and areas of focus for procurement organizations as we're halfway through 2025. What has changed? So
yeah. And I think it was a very insightful move of the Hackett Group to do an updated, kind of take on the priority survey that you guys run. Now, can I ask you, is this a typical practice from your guys' side, or is it something that you've done in a proactive but also reactive nature based upon the shifts that are happening in the market surrounding AI and the turbulence that people are facing in supply chain due to tariffs or geopolitical strains and resource shortages? I'm just curious, is this a typical mode of operating, or is it something that you guys yourselves were a bit reactive with?
You say that they say it's proactive and reactive, but it's not typical mode of operation for us.
No.
We've been doing the study for, I always say, over 15 years. Now I'm saying nearly 20 years. And, it has been all over that entire period of time, it's been an annual study. And so it's a study that we do at the tail end of every year, for the most part, the fall through early. Well, we don't actually, we have it all completed. So it's the fall time that we actually go out, because what we're trying to do is understand what people are focused on, where their priorities are, where are they investing in the next year. But with all of the change, the volatility in the marketplace, people are using the term VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's been very significant. And, one of the things I sat down with our head of research, and I said, I actually have a presentation coming up at a conference in June. And I feel like if I'm going to present what we saw at the beginning of the year, I'm going to be not necessarily highlighting what the true priorities are today. And so what we decided to do is in May, go out and do what I call a quick pulse update. Just go out. We didn't redo the entire study. We just took 3 questions. We relooked at priorities. We looked at where organizations are investing, and we also looked at just some of the projections when it came to spend cost savings, spend cost avoidances. So the study is much more broad, but those are the 3 areas I wanted to have an update on. Basically because of the volatility in the environment.
Now, at the tail end of 2024, your guys' data had shown in the initial study that procurement leaders were entering into 2025 with some bold expectations, especially surrounding cost reduction and transformation. Were those dominant priorities at the time, did they still remain?
Some of them do. So one of the things that we saw coming into this year was that cost was number one. Yeah. Now, a lot of folks in procurement will say, well, that's always number one. It's always, a highly prioritized, elevated priority for procurement. And you're right. If you look at our study over the, 15 to 20 years we've been running it, It's always been a top three. I don't think it's ever been out of the top three. And for the most part, it's been number one. So it's been the most perennial number one priority for procurement over that period of time. But if we went back to the period of time during the pandemic, what you would have saw was an elevation of protecting revenue within our companies. The risk, the disruptions that were occurred, it had pivoted from cost to protecting supply. And so what we saw was an elevation in that area. At one point, it was really, number one was protecting supply, just supply assurance to protect the revenue of our organizations. Number two was just dealing with some of the inflation that it was causing within our organization, which is tightly linked to cost, which was number three. But as soon as we came into 2024, and as we were entering that year, this is where you really saw the pivot of organizations starting to focus. I mean, some of the imbalances we had in supply and demand were being balanced. And with that, there was much more focus on clawing back some of this inflation that had occurred, and really getting more of a handle on the cost. It wasn't just getting supply at any cost anymore. Yeah, still want the supply, and it was much more accessible, as we move forward. But at the same time, we need to start to consider the cost, the margins in our organizations as we went forward. So that's where it really started to elevate. So your question is, do we see those areas? Yeah, cost. The thing that was different, and I think you mentioned it, was number three this year coming into 2025 was transforming the operating model of procurement. That is something we've never seen so elevated for procurement organizations. And I would say that was the biggest surprise that I saw.
Well, if you don't mind, let's break that down for a moment.
Yeah.
What do you think is at the true nucleus of that particular priority, right? What do teams mean when they say transforming the operating model in particular?
Yeah.
If you could break it down kind of, but also, keep it structured and a high level.
Yeah, one of the other priorities in our study is digital transformation. And I tell organizations, that is primarily focusing on technology. It is about creating a more digital environment within our procurement supply management organizations. When you start talking about the operating model, this is very broad. So it impacts all elements of conducting, managing, a procurement capability, a supply management capability within your organization. And when you consider all of those elements, this includes your processes, this includes your technology, as we were just mentioning, but it also includes your data and information that's consumed not only by the people, which we call human capital, because that's another dimension. It includes your structure of your organization. It includes decisions that you make as to where do I execute procurement activity around the world. Do I do it in a lower cost area? Do I do it more near shore? Do I do it in an area? I mean, certainly we've seen a lot of change in terms of the geographical distribution within our supply chains due to a lot of reasons, not just the tariffs that has been prompting some of those considerations as of late, but certainly COVID exposed a lot of, I'll say, vulnerabilities in our supply chains and the way that we've architected our supply networks. So operating model is something that considers the holistic view of all things that we do in supply management. And I think your next question is, well, why? and I will tell you, I believe a lot of that is because, we saw that and people were asking us that question. We as a team, as we look at our research and you see the result of these studies, you always have to ask yourself, well, why is that? It was something that we had an indication of in 2024 because it was elevated. It was number 5. And then it updated to number 3. And I truly believe organizations see the disruption that is coming, not only already here, but will accelerate, become more broad due to not only AI and generative AI, but specifically agentic AI as we look forward. And I believe we're going to see that acceleration more in the second half of this year and certainly into 2026 and beyond. And as a result of that, I think organizations are just, and not just I think, they have to sort of step back and understand if this is going to be the environment, how does that fundamentally change everything that we go do? You know, one of the biggest questions has been around talent and skills.
That's super interesting. And I think that then the question comes, right? Does AI, I mean, AI obviously jumped in the Pulse report. This is not a shocker, I think, to anyone, right? As to the priority list. Does AI now become at the center of an operating model, right? I think that's a question moving forward. Does that come before maybe, you know, the people and the processes? Is how are we going to leverage this new super engine that we have?
I would say that it is what's causing a lot of the rethinking, as I would say, the transformation, the re-engineering, however you want to describe it, if we're looking at our operating model. And again, understanding that the operating model, some people use the term, Hackett uses the term service delivery model. How does that fundamentally change as we look forward? And as many of us have been exposed to, is we're starting to consider, you know, what does it look like? You know, one of the best things I like to ask organizations is if we're sitting here if we're in 2025, let's say 2028, what does a day in the life of a procurement professional look like then? But even looking out at 2030, I think that's very difficult to describe today than it was, say, in 2010, 2015. I've characterized,
or at the end of 2024, right? I mean, I think that your study shows that the things are moving at a pace that I think no one could ever truly foresee, and therefore, right, there is a continuous impact of new kind of modes of operating that we're all going to have to get on board with, right? I think that if we've seen something in the last 6 months, it's that with the switch of the adoption of a technology, right, we can pretty much throw out our priorities of just 6 months ago and realign, right, and re-engineer, I think, in a lot of ways. Now, I wanted to touch on something because you mentioned, of course, that there is, you know, some shifts in priorities. And one of those that I thought was interesting, because of course it's a hot topic, particularly in the North American market, is surrounding sustainable procurement and sustainability. You know, supplier diversity has long been a topic. You know, we now have an administration in the United States that is, you know, deprioritizing DEI within their own, you know, kind of realm of control. I'm curious, has this fallen out of the initiative due to actual deprioritization, or do you think that there is bandwidth limitations in this more volatile market, and that something like sustainable procurement is seen as more of a, you know, mid or long-term ambition and priority?
Well, I'll answer that in a number of different ways, because if we're talking about sustainability hit the high point in our study from a priority standpoint back in 2022. And it was the year that we saw sustainability and just procurement's involvement in driving sustainability, you know, more, you know, the upstream within the supply chain itself, within the organization, and really taking that as the responsibility. It was number 4 in priority. So it broke into what we call the top 5. But if you broke it down a little bit further, because our study is across multiple geographies, the
Right.
3 primary geographies is North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And when you look at that, it was much more elevated and probably not surprising in Europe. It was actually number 1. It was higher than cost. It was higher than all the other priorities in Europe. But when we looked at North America.
In 2022.
In 2022, yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, sorry. Just wanted to clarify that. Very interesting.
And so this was coming into 2022. And then if you went back and you looked at the U.S., it was further down. I still think it was I'm trying to remember, but I think it was still a top 5. It may have been 5. But when you blend all that together, it came out to like number 4 on a more global basis. And so it really hit a high point then. And then what we saw, the next several years was that it still remained in the top 10. It was just further down. But the thing that we always saw was a differentiation between where it's viewed and prioritized for those leaders of supply management and procurement in Europe versus in the U.S. And, certainly in the U.S., it's been less a elevated priority than it has been in Europe. But the thing is also you can look at these broader perspectives geographically or even globally, but a lot of times it comes down to the company itself. And so you'll see certain companies where it's much more elevated than others, and where it's you have some companies you go out to and it's really not a top priority. And right. You asked the question, is this the result of just having a lot of priorities? I would say yes, I think to some degree. One of the things I used to say is, coming into 2020, because this is where we really saw the shift. When I went back into 2015 or 2015 in earlier, we would come up with those top 10. And one of my favorite things I'd like to do is I'd go out to leaders of procurement. I'd say, well, here's what we came up with in our study. And as we went through it, I'd ask them, I said, well, which of these priorities are yours? And typically I would get a leader of procurement would go through it and say, you know what, Chris, number 1 is one of our priorities. Number 4, number 8. Others would say it's number 2, number 4, and number 6, or number 7. You'd have they would select some of these. When I asked that same question, and I think it started really in the 2020, maybe 21, 2022 kind of time frame, I would ask that question, and the answer I get now, all of them. And so what you see is a breadth of priorities. And right. But the thing is, it's not replacing anything. It's here I'm a leader in supply management. And what's happening, it's an augmentation. This is not a replacement. It's not like saying, well, cost was your top priority last year. We're not going to replace it with sustainability. No, I mean, it may be different priorities, but you know what? You still have to deliver on cost and meet our objectives in that way. But you're now going to focus on sustainability as well. It didn't replace anything. So what you see is this augmentation and just proliferation of priorities that we have to do. And, this was really evident during the pandemic and certainly coming out of it. One of the things I've done on the sideline is I've been working at my doctorate degree, and my doctoral dissertation focused on looking at the supply network in organizations as a result of the COVID pandemic. And I studied a specific industry. I studied the medical device industry, and you can, just the biggest companies in that space. And what I was looking at is, how did they design their supply networks prior to COVID? Right. And then as that opened up, and then as we went further, what changed? And what you saw was that the design criteria was primarily around assurance of supply and cost. And when you look forward, what you saw was that changing. Other things elevated. At the same time, the design became much more difficult because we had to start to consider not only cost in the design, but we were putting much more focus on risk. It wasn't like risk wasn't focused on before, but what you saw was a much more equally balanced, consideration. The fact that we're considering multiple sources of supply today, where we know if, the least expensive way to do things is to have a single source of supply, with a single supplier and leverage that. That was the technique we utilized. Well, we're now considering it and say, hey, we want to have a cost advantage, but at the same time, we need to protect our ability to supply. And now we have to consider, the cost implications of the geographies that we source out of, due to tariffs and all of that. And so it's become very complicated. So many priorities that we have to balance.
So priorities are abundant. They might scale up or scale down. Like you said, you speak to leaders and those priorities are all of their priorities. So it's also a case of having to do even more with the same amount of resources, right? I think that this is a case as old as time, and I think something that many functions in the business are experiencing at the moment. What you did say there, though, is that agility in lines of supply, alternative lines of supply, reducing volatility, increasing resilience in a supply chain, practicing things like friendshoring, nearshoring. These are important for businesses in this day and age, which goes against, as you said, some of the more traditional methods of getting the lowest price by choosing a line of supply, buying more in bulk, right?
Yeah.
With that being said, we also saw SRM as one of the priorities shift down the list. I can't remember if it was from 4 or 5 down to number 8 on the priority list.
Yeah. Well,
do you see that this is kind of going against the grain of the exact priorities that you just said are very important to the businesses to be able to create resilience and agility in a broader supplier base? Just curious if what your thinking is on that.
Yeah, one of the things that's always puzzled me in the priorities is your point on supplier relationships. So if we went back over the years, we would not have seen specifically supplier relationships in the top 10. And one of the things that we saw change this year, coming into this year, was the elevation of relationships into the top 10. And, my comment was it's about time. Right? Because we learned this. We exposed the lack of relationships in a multi-tier upstream supply chain, supply network within our organizations. One of the things that not only our research at Hackett, but some of my research, that I've done academically, really exposed the lack of relationships that occurred, at least in this one particular industry, tier 2, tier 3, and beyond. The relationships were primarily with tier 1. And so when you look at supplier relationships, I think there was a challenge even in tier 1, but certainly beyond that, they did not necessarily exist. And one of the things that's always interesting is that, I would ask organizations, I said, well, one would say that we didn't focus on relationships beyond tier 1 as the OEM, the manufacturer within a particular supply chain. And I'd ask them, I said, well, why? Well, we relied on our tier 1s to manage those relationships, where I had opposing viewpoints from other leaders and CPOs that said, no, we focus on relationships with tier 2, tier 3. We want to make sure that they understand we as the OEM, we as the end before it goes to the final consumer and customer, that they understand how critical and what that product is that they're building for, because a lot of times that's invisible to them. So I was always looking at that and saying, well, why was that? Even during the pandemic, I saw the success of companies that had strong relationships with their suppliers. It made a difference in their ability to get access to supply, et cetera. And so then I would look at our priorities, and it just never elevated until this year. And so to what I just said, I said, it's about time. But that was short-lived because, that was coming into this year. And then, we did our Pulse update, that we talked about at the beginning in May. So we did it the month of May and we completed it at the end of May, and relationships fell out. I think it's also part of what you said before. It's just the volume of priorities that we have. I don't believe that you sit there and procurement organizations are sitting there saying, well, it's not important. And again, I'm only giving people the visibility to the top 10. There are, like 25 priorities that we rank and have all of these companies rank as to, what's important to them. Because we ask them, I said, well, is it important? Number two, if it is important, how important is it? Is it critical? Is it a high priority, a medium priority, a low priority? We use those two factors to do this ranking in the study itself.
Very interesting. It spurred just now upon a question that I was thinking about, because, we talk often in my sales organization about understanding what is blinking red, or what is on the CEO's top priority list. The top 5, the top 10 of the exec team, right? It made me think. Where do you think that procurement and sourcing slots in right now to the top priorities as far as a broader business priority? Do you think that where is a procurement function making the biggest impact in 2025 right now? I'm just curious of your thoughts there. You work with a lot of, global multinational businesses, and I'm sure that there's strong alignment there, with the broader business goals and metrics between the procurement supply chain function and, the broader goals. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things you have to consider in these organizations is the alignment between that supply management procurement organization and the business itself. And I'd like to say that all of our procurement and supply management organizations that I run into and talk to and advise, are very aligned with the business. But that'd not be truthful. There are gaps. And the challenge is a procurement organization is, what they do is challenging, because it's something that we used to talk about years ago, is the multiple stakeholders that we have. Procurement and supply management, it's an enterprise capability. Right? Everybody is involved in this. And I always tell procurement organizations, you're not going to be successful in what you do without the enterprise. We can do category management, we can do sourcing, we can do supply management, we can do all of these things. But to be effective, you have to have that coordination and engagement of the enterprise as well, because this is an enterprise capability. It's not just a procurement capability. And so companies need this capability. You asked about CEOs and, just the executive team, where this is today. And I know a lot of people have said this, that, as bad as COVID was, it was a gift for supply management organizations, because it elevated the awareness, the visibility, the importance, priority of supply.
Everyone finally got this seat at the table that they like to whine about so much on LinkedIn as well, huh?
And one of the things I say, there's two things that drove supply management leaders into the boardroom, above the executive committee. One was assurance of supply, and number two, and protecting revenue specifically. And number two was diversity / potentially sustainability, but more diversity, especially within the U.S., because of the reputational, kinds of concerns. And that was primarily early in 2020 and 2021. The question is have we remained? And this is where is that you see that. So I don't think that, if I'm a board and I've invited procurement in to better understand, the concerns, the risks that are out there, is there something that I have to know, and that we have to understand from a risk standpoint that would have a material impact on our business, because it's been exposed. It's not going away. Now, we may not be going into the boardroom as frequently. I know some organizations, some of their leaders, they were invited in, they did present, they were doing it on a quarterly basis, but they're not doing it as frequently now. But, some of them are doing it, et cetera. But the recognition is there. So I don't think that's going to go away.
Right.
I think so you have this broad-based awareness. The thing that's elevating us now, especially in manufacturing organizations, as you well know, are the tariffs. What are those and what is the impact on our organization? So that's been something that has certainly driven a lot of, I'll say, exercise and a lot of scenario modeling within organizations, since I would say midpoint of last year, if you were looking ahead and understanding that this may be coming, but certainly after November, and it definitely got elevated in January when a lot of this stuff started to come to fruition. So
yeah, but interesting insights, like you said. It's a bit of a shame, of course, that a global pandemic, geopolitical tensions, resource shortages, as well as then also kind of the tariff situation, volatility as a whole, right, is the thing that drives the mission criticality of procurement. But that's the way the world looks. For everything,
right? It's like, true. I'm a firm believer in constraint-driven innovation. I mean, if you're in a company and everything is going well, you're making a lot of money. I'm not saying everybody, but few companies are going to do something different. It's typically when something happens, there's a disruption, there's a constraint. And these disruptions drive innovation. I mean, look what's happening as a result of, all the innovation that occurred due to the disruption caused by the pandemic. And certainly there's a lot of innovation that's occurring just as a result of what's happening with the tariffs. Certainly solution providers are coming up with all kinds of tools. We're looking at, how do we apply, AI to help with a lot of that. And so it drives, these constraints drive the innovation. So in many ways, it's to your point, left to our own devices, I don't think we would have that. It's the challenges that really drive it.
But I think that what you're highlighting here, and I know what I can guess what you're going to say at least, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think that it always comes up, this kind of dichotomy in the times of volatility and, when change is forced upon one, or it's an uncertain market, right? Yeah. Do we invest through the volatility to be able to create competitive edge, or do we tighten the purse strings to batten down the hatches and be conservative in times of volatility, right? And I think what we are seeing is that there is a lot more businesses that are a lot more attuned to this idea of investing through the crisis, as they saw, I think, a few years ago, winners come out on the other side following the pandemic. And I want to touch upon the AI piece, during today's episode as well. Yeah. The updated report showed that AI and Gen AI and core procurement tech, they climb the ranks. I mean, really jump the ranks. Survival or just productivity? I mean, are people seeing this now soon as table stakes?
Yeah, I think it's several reasons. So when what you're referring to, so when we did our, the 2025, when we published that in January, the period of time by which we were gathering that information was in the fall. So we started, I think it was the beginning of October, and we ran that study through the end of November. And so when we came out of it, there's two things. One is the priorities, which we've been talking a lot about. What are the priorities that these leaders in supply management have, and how have they pivoted as we further go into 2025? The other thing we ask about is investments. And this is where the point you made is, when we published that report in January, generative AI and AI was 9th on the list as to the number of organizations, this whole population of companies that we went out to in North America and Europe and Asia Pacific. it was a more limited set of organizations. So we would rank all of these areas because what we were fundamentally asking is that where are you going to invest to improve capabilities in 2025? And so ninth on that list was AI/generative AI, et cetera. We redid the study, as you know, in May, and it jumped to number 2. Now,
so what changed, right? Because, I mean, we all know that it is at the forefront of driving productivity and efficiency in businesses in so many different ways. But what changed in such a short period of time?
I think there's several things. I think it's agentic AI is one of it, because I do believe that agentic, the ability to create agents, is much more digestible for individuals to understand than, I'll say, the more esoteric generative AI. Generative AI really came to the forefront, I'd say, in business in 2023. Not that it didn't exist in 22, 21. My kids are coming from school and they're saying, "Dad, look at this. I'm creating a paper and it's using this chat GPT." And I didn't know what it was.
I'm sure that your teachers are very happy.
I'm sitting there going, I don't think you're supposed to do that. I don't believe. But I was intrigued. I said, wow, look at this. I said, I need to use this. And, but the thing is, we were talking so broad around it. We were trying to understand the technology, the large language models and all the things, the RAGs and all these things that went into it. And I think we were losing sight of what the power of what it could do. I saw it in my company and other companies. We were so focused on understanding the technology and we were losing sight of what it could actually do. What I believe that happened, and I believe it's why we see this elevation in priority, is that agentic AI makes it more real because it's more task-based. I can understand taking and building an agent to do a specific piece of work. One of the things that's very common out there, I can have an agent that has a specific task to summarize a document, a contract, for example. That's a very common task. People have been doing that. They've been doing it with just generic generative AI, et cetera. But now we can create an agent that this is my agent that they do that type of work for me. Right. And we start thinking about all the different ways. And so what I believe has happened is that, that has occurred. There's a much more understanding of what it can do. And so, so that's one thing. I think the rush, I always say it's like sort of like an arms race out there. Everybody's coming out, the solution provider space. I mean, everybody's got their agents and it's like a war of agents. How many agents do you have? All the new ones that are being introduced daily, weekly, whatever. And, it's happening. And it's coming from much further than just the procure tech space. I mean, Amazon and AWS Marketplace, and, they're all over the place. And so you have this proliferation. And so I think all of these sort of coming together has said, I can do something here, and it's elevated. Plus, they're getting a lot of pressure in their companies. There's a lot of investments going on. I do believe there's some concern and fear because I'm a firm believer that this is more digestible and can have a significant impact on organizations, in that it does have the possibility of creating bigger gaps between organizations that are able to digest this, embed it, and utilize it with their environment than those that don't. And I think these gaps between organizations can grow very rapidly because I think the deployment of this can be very rapid too. Now, there's always those enablers. I have to, ready my team, the individuals, the professionals in my environment. I have to make sure I ready the data, for some of this. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I have to do. There are enablers that I have to consider. But the disruption, from a good point, will be significant. And I think that's what's elevated this. I think the recognition, the realization, the realness of it, the much more awareness has what's elevated it, and just the pressure. Boy, I mean, you wake up every day and everybody's talking about the stock market. You look at NVIDIA and everything. All those GPU, that's all driving all of this. I mean, it's just it's a feeding frenzy out there. So I was not surprised. I would have been very surprised if it hadn't elevated to the level that it was. But I'll make one last point. Number one is still data. So I think what you see is that procurement organizations recognize it's not just about the technology. There are fundamental things that we have to do to make all of this work.
Such good insights. And I think that the point that I think everyone should take with them is this understanding of what can we do? Where is the problem first? And of course, AI can be the solution, right? But you have to start with a desired end state to a problem, right? A hypothesis of what can I go and solve for. But I understand what you're saying, right? The change was a slow burn potentially because businesses were almost in this paralysis by analysis. Like you said, trying to dive so deep in understanding the technology and losing sight of the targets that they could be able to reach with that technology applied. Very interesting take on it. Now, I wanted to try and round things off, and we love to have a quick fire round with our guests because honestly, I could talk to you all day, Chris, but we're reaching our time. We don't want to let you go without getting some hot takes from you. We do a quick fire round with all of our guests, understanding a little bit more about you, Chris Sawchuk, the person, outside of maybe the function as the procurement expert. Is that okay?
That is fine.
Fantastic.
So I have something interesting to say. So
one word or one sentence answers is what we're looking for.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
So is there a book within business or personal that you would recommend to any of our listeners?
I would say the book that I have always liked is The World's Greatest Salesman by Og Mandino. It's a small book, and I'm going beyond my 1 minute, but let me give you a perspective as to why it is.
Yeah, please.
I used to work for IBM many years ago, and I remember I was going from being an engineer to a marketing / sales type of capability within IBM. And I was a little bit anxious about it because I had never been in that, customer facing kind of role. And I asked one of the salespeople and, marketing executives, what's a piece of advice you can give me? And his piece of advice, it says, read this book. This is Og Mandino, The World's Greatest Salesman. And, one of the things I always remember this analogy in the book, they went out because it was one of the things that Og Mandino talked about was the idea of persistence. And a lot of times when you're in sales and things like that, you're just going and going and going, and you say, God, it's not being as successful, et cetera. And the analogy he used is like chopping down a tree. And he said, when you go to a tree and you have an axe and you start to chop that tree down, you have no idea how many swings it's going to take before that tree is going to fall. But you know that if you keep on swinging, eventually that tree is going to fall. And I think there's a lot of folks that stop swinging before they actually get to it because it's going to happen. So that's
inspirational.
The book. I think
that it transcends as well a professional context as well. So thank you for sharing that. That's a great analogy for sure.
Yeah.
If we shift away from the professional for a moment, with an all expenses trip paid, you're able to leave tomorrow, take your family, go by yourself. It's up to you. Where are you heading?
I'm headed to Europe. My wife and my family, we love spending time in Europe. And, we would head somewhere.
One place in particular?
I would say it would be in Austria or Switzerland, anywhere in the mountains. We love to hike.
Nice.
And, so I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to hike in the Pyrenees, hike in the Alps, obviously. And it's just such a beautiful country. I love to get away. I love to be just in out in the country. I'd say, also the Rocky Mountains as well. Anywhere that you can do that. Certainly I live in Florida, so there ain't no mountains here. But when we hike, we love to be in the mountains. And I just love being in Europe doing that.
Very cool. Now let's shift back to procurement for one last take.
Yeah.
Finish the sentence here. Procurement in 2026 will be defined by
agentic AI blending. Interesting.
And what does the blending part mean?
It's the blending with the human capability within our environments. This is not something that's going to take over. Many people use the term, it's agentic AI is not going to take over your job. It's the people that know how to use it that will. And so I believe we're going to see a much more blended environment, especially with agentic AI. And how we do that is really going to be able to, define many organizations in terms of how they blend these together. I used to use an analogy. This was way before we started talking about AI. This was back in the digital transformation elevation, I would say, in 2018. I used to show a picture of Iron Man. And I used to call it, I said, this is the perfect blending of human and technology. And that's really where we're headed is how do we blend these two capabilities together? And so that's what I see the environment being as we look forward.
And the one thing to remember about Iron Man is that there's a human at the core.
There's a
Thank
human
you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for dropping so much knowledge on our listeners. If they want to get in touch with you, learn more about Hackett, get access to the study that we're speaking about, what's the best way about going about that?
You can, if you just want to learn about Hackett, you certainly go to our website and there's information there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can just reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm there. I don't have a lot of information about myself, but I just haven't ever put a lot on my LinkedIn. That's probably the best way is LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for today's episode, Chris. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, Sam. Thank you for the opportunity.